Okay, so here's just kind of a short introduction into the chapter beyond what we've already talked about. But just as a refresher, again, this is a piece that's making an intervention into streaming history, right? And just as a refresher, there is a critique in the piece, right? Tryon has something that he wants to say, which again, he's presenting evidence that he's sort of aggregated, and then the conclusions in the claim or the argument that's stemming from that evidence, which is again the kind of argumentation that we're building, that we're trying to work on, even in these sort of horrific circumstances. Which again, I hope that you're all okay. Please stay safe, and let me know if I can help with anything. But as we've already sort of talked about, I mean, on some level, right, what is this about? It's really about a kind of contradiction, right? Which, going back to the idea of like what's perceived and what's promised and what's actual. There's a sort of ethical claim here, or there's something like a problematic that Tryon is trying to suggest in the relationship between the producers or the industry and the consumers that I mean, hypocrisy is this kind of, again, a little too, it's not that it's too charged, it's just that it's too stale a term. It doesn't really get to, I think, all the sort of folds and dimensions as to what's going on. But that might be dishonesty might be something that might fit a little bit better. But it's this suggestion, right, that what's being promised just doesn't really match up with the actual end product, and this is something that we go through on a daily basis. And I think the real question that someone like Tryon is asking on some level is like, why do we continue to kind of live in this way where we're constantly being promised certain things and even accept those promises and believe them to be true? It's that kind of fool me once, fool me twice, and keep on fooling me on some level, right? But specifically, it's this promise or the promises of digital utopias, right? This is something that's constantly come up. And again, I want us to think about how much we buy into this, right? Do streaming capacities and internet infrastructure and platforms, do they promise some sort of wildly open democratic space that's especially in terms of universal access, right? Internet for all. And I think it's pretty clear that this is something that's the shift to the online, right? From us moving to an offline to an online space, and even that's not totally true. We're always already kind of online and offline, but primarily offline to primarily online. This is something that we need to be thinking about. It's particularly kind of relevant to the course, and as we know, all sorts of hitches have already kind of revealed themselves, that it's like, no, this is an incredibly difficult shift, and so it does kind of put a damper on this sort of idea that anything is possible, and not only the kind of critical shift is not only that anything is possible, but it's possible for everyone. And time and time again we've seen that's just not true, right? It's a question of degree. It might be more possible for some people, but certainly not for all people, right? And that's kind of really at the crux of this. So for one, that's kind of the critique, right, that Tryon is mounting, the subject being, not just kind of Hulu and Netflix, but the entire, and not just streaming media, but this idea of like an on-demand culture, right? Culture. And specifically what Tryon says in terms of like the characteristics of this on-demand culture. So think of it this way, is that there are many things about on-demand culture that we could kind of focus on or talk about. It's not like it has one detail or one kind of characteristic, one kind of specificity. But you have to think about someone like Tryon is essentially saying, like, but if you boil down to the most significant, substantial, or most kind of evident, or even, kind of troubling characteristic, like what defines this, what defines me, what defines you, it's not that it's negating the kind of multitude or multiplicity of a given thing, but it's saying, but at the end of the day, this is the thing that stands out most, right? And so for you and I, what might stand out for Netflix is ease of access or sort of excellence of content. But for someone like Tryon, he's trying to suggest that on-demand culture, like, no, what it actually kind of comes down to is that it's really about the process of, just because I don't want to write out the entire thing, but it's about control, and control in the sense of what? It's about the process of limiting and restricting when and where content is available. So control of content, right? Available, right? So control by whom, controlling, like, to whom, against whom, on whom, I guess. It's basically distributors, networks, platforms having the control of how consumers access content, right? So it's not only so that's the thing, right? Is that if you think in one end, right? Like, yeah, but I can do it from home. I can do it from Waterville. I can do it from Asia. I can do it from a phone. Sure, if we count all those ways, it might seem like it's kind of bountiful, but someone like Tryon is trying to point out, but like, is it really, right? It's like, or are we not thinking about the ways that it's being restricted, right? The ways that we don't have access, and when is it that we don't when is it that like that kind of bubbles to the forefront of our brain? Like, oh, it's like, well, this is kind of actually a big inconvenience. Is when it breaks down, right? So when the access kind of is taken away, right? Specifically, so like his examples of this, right? And we all know this to some degree, but again, it's kind of worth pointing out. Is for one, the partial catalogs, right? Meaning, and we talked about this to a certain degree. The idea that if we think about, like, for the fact that basically the majority of the 20th century as far as cinema and television is concerned doesn't exist for Netflix. There are whole years of cinema history that just aren't represented, right? So like that's a partial catalog. The idea that it's constantly being changed, right? So I was doing research just this weekend, and there was a film that was part of the research that I knew was on Netflix, so I didn't bother trying to kind of find a duplicate copy, whether it was through whatever means, and it was gone. Within, I just looked at it probably a month ago. So you kind of have to sort of keep abreast of those changes, right? And that comes down to essentially, as we've seen before, rights, the streaming rights, right? It's not like buying the physical media, which we also know is not, right. It's not infinite, or it's not permanent, right? It's like the media can and will degrade, as we've seen time and time again. But it's much more kind of ephemeral, right? It's so much more subject to change. And I think so to kind of move on, like his interest, right? Just to set up sort of, again, to set up the chapter, is that as a result of this, like basically what he's trying to say is, on some level we all know this, right? And the data proves this, right? That if people were totally satisfied, they wouldn't be doing or looking for alternatives. That's why so even if we go to, like, just kind of jump ahead to cord cutting, like people wouldn't be cord cutting if they were happy with cable, right? Similarly, like Disney Plus wouldn't be making a lot of business or cutting into Netflix's profit if Netflix was enough, right? So they're all they and they get into this, but in looking at the sort of alternative practices, which to try and become resistant practices, there is also an acknowledgement that even that on a kind of general level that there is, it might not be explicit, and sometimes, I mean, actually it is, but it might not be kind of really pointed, but there is a general understanding that something is not quite up to snuff, right? And so he points out that, like, you know, a wide range of the practices, so let's say like practices, consumer practices, and that kind of gets to the title of the piece, right? The restricting and resistant mobility. So the resistant mobilities part of this, right, is that users are adopting those practices. A lot of them, of course, are illegal, but they are to cultivate, you know, to find sort of their own, or to tailor an experience that suits them more. And on some level, stop myself from touching my face. Another way to put this is that, and I've already kind of said a version of this already, but if streaming platforms were sufficient and as satisfying as so often we make them seem to be, or we make them out to be, then we wouldn't be constantly looking for alternatives, right? And just as a general kind of, you know, sort of, you know, practice, like a theory, or like just like a kind of, you know, like a critical practice, you know, think about that. Like when we are kind of actively seeking for alternatives, like what is at the kind of core of that practice? Like why would we do that? Why would one do that? Well, you know, it gets us to kind of go back and think about, well, what is it that we're kind of like trying to address, trying to kind of get away from, maybe even, but there's something there, right, in that relationship, if that makes sense. And so finally, this gets him to kind of coin the phrase resistant mobilities. So, which really is this relationship, right, that we're being promised certain new mobilities, but it's not being delivered, and so we're looking for our own mobilities that are kind of challenging the mobilities that are actually restrictive, right? And that's again kind of sort of an interesting idea, right? Like how can you be offering mobilities, right, that are actually restrictive, right? And one way to think about this is like even just on a basic metaphorical level. If you tell, you know, a child like you can go in that room and the room is this big, or even if it's huge, sure, that's a new, like, you know, new place that they can go, but you're still kind of giving them parameters or a limit, right? So they're still, you're letting them, right? You're allowing them to go in that space because you have control of that space, because you know, and I mean that metaphor already kind of gets sort of tricky, right? Because it does become a question of like safety and such, but that is something to be thinking about, right? So it's like on a similar level, you know, even with this, right? Tryon is suggesting, right, and I mean, I guess just to kind of talk my way out of this, the difference between that, like, you know, saying like to a child, right, it's like, oh, well, you know, you kind of have to stay there is because that really has something more to do with kind of like well-being and safety. The point here, right, though, is that like with Tryon is that the restricted, like, the restrictive mobilities and kind of constraining what the consumer can do is not really, you know, for the sake of the consumer. So the metaphor still holds, but there's that critical dimension which isn't exactly the same, right? So on 41, let's see. This is the first page, right? That second partial paragraph, he says, resistant mobilities are activities that defy the practices promoted by the entertainment industry. So basically, you know, it's when consumers say, like, you can't tell me what to do, right? And they do what they want. And that includes piracy, cord cutting, SVOD, network websites, and digital downloads. Already in these, cord cutting, I think, and piracy are probably, and even piracy, right, we've already seen, is not nearly as sort of kind of widespread as it once was, right? I mean, that statistic that Netflix has already exceeded BitTorrent is still kind of a crazy statistic. Cord cutting would be one of the, I think, the most relevant one at this point. Network websites, I really don't I guess I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I don't know how prominent or not that would be. But some of this stuff is moving so quickly that even and again, please don't disregard a rating or or an article because it's 5 years old, or 10 years old. Like, that doesn't automatically mean that it's no longer relevant. I'm just pointing out that some of this stuff is moving so quickly that some of the details might not be as immediately kind of applicable, but that certainly doesn't mean that the chapter or the book doesn't have something to offer for us. So why don't we go on and move on into restricting mobility.